Fox News Chief National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin. Jennifer, good morning. The operation has begun, and you have some insight on what may have been some of the initial targeting.
That's right, Griff. But before I get to those initial targets, we can confirm that there were sirens not only in Bahrain, but also Qatar. That is significant because it suggests incoming missiles into both of those countries where the U.S. military has key bases. In Bahrain, of course, home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. We are hearing reports that there is smoke rising on the horizon in the vicinity of that base. We also understand that, again, Qatar would be a logical target because Al Udeid would be the largest U.S. air base in the Middle East. They obviously have removed a lot of the airframes and warplanes from that base in anticipation of this. Americans who are living in Bahrain, UAE, Qatar have been told to shelter in place, and the U.S. military had dispersed a lot of its personnel. Remember, there were about 30,000 to 40,000 American troops at bases across the Middle East, but the U.S. military over the last 2 months have been drawing down and reorienting those individuals. Now, here are some of the targets that we can confirm in these dozens of strikes that have taken place in the last 3.5, 4 hours. The Iranian parliament was targeted. The National Supreme Council was targeted. Ministry of Intelligence, Iranian Atomic Energy Agency. Cyber attacks have taken place on news agencies such as IRNA, which is the state-run news organization. The internet is out in Iran, as far as we know, so it's going to be very difficult for civilians in Iran to get the information about what's occurring right now. There are unconfirmed reports that Iran's defense minister was targeted, as well as the head of the judiciary. That would be significant because the head of the judiciary would have delivered many death sentences, thousands of death sentences to protesters over the years. So it would be logical that he would have been a target. But what's clear, Griff, from these initial strikes is that this is an attempt at regime change. We've talked in recent days about how broad would this mission be? Would it be only the nuclear sites? Would it be the nuclear sites plus the ballistic missile storage sites, which Israel was very concerned about and had pressed the U.S. to include as part of the targeting? Now it is extremely clear that this is a targeted, the strikes are targeting Iran's leadership, including the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who Lucas Tomlinson was reporting took power over 37 years ago. He took over in 1989. He's the longest-serving leader in the Middle East, and his compound was targeted in the early hours, in maybe even the first strike that took place. That is symbolic and that is significant. And you heard the president appeal to the Iranian people, saying that this moment is a moment in history that you should seize. After the bombing stops, he appealed to them to rise up, and he said, the hour of your freedom is now. He said, stay in your house until we are finished, but this is the moment that you can take over your government and seize power. That is significant because we weren't sure that this was going to be a regime change operation, but it's very clear from the initial set of targets that that is exactly what it is, Griff.
Jennifer, just as you were starting your reporting there, we're seeing on the wires that Bahrain is confirming the headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet has been targeted by a missile attack, and the president adding in that video message that American casualties are a real possibility here as we wake up now and learn of this major joint combat operation between the U.S. and Israel is launched. This could pose a significant threat to Americans in this operation.
I think what's significant, Griff, is that the American people and even the president himself have been used to carrying out some very significant military operations in which there were no U.S. casualties. The operation in Venezuela last summer, the days of striking during the 12-day war, targeting the nuclear sites. It's significant that the U.S. has not put ground troops in the Middle East. So that is a big difference from the 2003 Iraq War. There's been no large buildup of any sort of ground forces. That is not part of the planning or part of the calculation. This is going to be an air and Navy operation. But again, the Iranians, while they may have been stunned and surprised in the initial hours, and it took them about 3.5 to 4 hours before they launched their first missiles toward Israel and now toward the U.S. base in Bahrain and as well as in Qatar, they were likely, the command and control was likely disrupted in those initial hours. There was likely some electronic warfare that caused it so they couldn't figure out which way anything was coming and how to, and then it was difficult to fire those missiles. But now you can expect in the coming hours and days, the Iranians have a large store of missiles, and they have mobile missile launchers in the west. And at the narrowest point in the Strait of Hormuz, it's just 21 miles across. So those cruise missiles can be fired, and ballistic missiles, and it takes literally minutes before they reach their target. So that is very hard to defend against, even if you have Patriot missile defense systems and THAAD missile systems. And so the U.S. military had done a really good job of drawing down at those bases. I doubt there were more than a few dozen people at the Bahrain headquarters of the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. So again, the president preparing the American people that there could be casualties, and that that's unfortunately a side effect of an outcome of war. But again, the American people have gotten used to having no casualties in these recent, very successful operations that the military has carried out. That may not be the case with this. This is a much different operation involving many, many more troops and airmen and sailors. And it is, very possible there can be accidents as well as strikes by the Iranians. That cannot be ruled out at this point.
And as we learn more, Jennifer, we'll find out exactly how this initial operation started. But I think it was very fascinating that you brought up, of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, a ground invasion. And the force posture at that time had 5 U.S. carrier strike groups in the Mediterranean, in the Arabian Sea, and the Persian Gulf. This time, we've had 2, the Lincoln in the Arabian Sea and the Ford in the Mediterranean, a different posture. But one thing that we have now that we didn't have then is the technology to advance map some of those defense systems that Iran has, particularly using our F-22 Raptors, seeing that unprecedented positioning of a dozen Raptors sitting on the tarmac and Ovid Air Base in Israel. And talk to me about the technology of how the F-22, the Raptor, and its technology to go in and map their defense systems, working in conjunction with our elite F-35s. It's been described as a little bit of a 1-2 punch. You've got a quarterback, the F-35, and the F-22, the assassin, how that may have played a role here in helping critically disable Iran's missile defense system.
Well, I think it's probably premature to say that their missile defense system has been disabled at this point. Certainly last summer, it was degraded significantly from those strikes. And you're right that F-22s and F-35s would have been involved in taking out some of those missile launchers. But as we mentioned, many of these missile launchers are mobile, and they're very difficult to track down. You're right that the U.S. has been mapping the sites as well, the fixed sites, as well as much of using, we have the National Geospatial Agency uses satellites, and those satellites, you can see, a pin on the ground. They are so clear. And so they have been mapping using numerous surveillance technologies in recent months and over the past year. So the F-22s, what's significant about that, Griff, is that this is the first time in history that the F-22s have been deployed and based in Israel. In the past, the U.S. military would not base warplanes to take off from Israel. But what we're seeing, because of the lack of runways and airspace and tarmacs, because they have drawn down from Al Udeid and Al Dhafra in the Gulf, you're having to find more space for those planes. But the F-22s being in Israel, along with those 14 air refueling tankers, that suggests to me that this is going to be happening over a number of days, if not longer, and there are going to be waves of strikes. And we have just seen the first launch. And as I was mentioning earlier, most likely the initial launch was carried out by Tomahawk missiles. You would do that, and you would also use standoff weapons that can be fired from outside of Iranian airspace to protect your forces and your planes while you see what the Iranian missile defense and air defense systems, which ones have survived, how many have survived, and you'll know that pretty soon after this initial launch.
And just lastly, Jennifer, as our viewers are waking up with combat operations just starting, let's talk about sort of the last we heard of negotiations. The foreign minister to Oman, Badr al-Busaidi, did an interview with CBS's Margaret Brennan saying that peace was still within reach and saying that Iran was possibly willing to give up their enrichment program. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the problem is we didn't hear that from the Iranian leadership themselves. We didn't hear it from the Iranian negotiator, the foreign minister Araghchi, when he was in Geneva. And after those talks took place in Geneva, the Omani foreign minister did his level best. He was mediating in Geneva between Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner on the one hand, and the foreign minister Araghchi of Iran on the other hand. The two sides were still pretty far apart, from what I understand. And one of the problems is that the Iranians continued to stick to their talking points of that they have the right to enrich uranium. Now, there was some significant movement, according to the Omani foreign minister, that they had offered some concessions about with the highly enriched uranium and how to deal with that and where to hand it over in some ways. But again, there was nothing concrete. And the problem with the Iranians is that they do drag out these negotiations. And the problem with the U.S. military is that once you have built up a force like this, you were talking about the F-22s, the F-22s really can't sit on the tarmac and not be flying missions for too long. They're a very delicate plane, very, very sophisticated, and they need to fly almost every day to keep from having maintenance problems. So you can't really set the force and have it sit there and wait for too long. You have the exhaustion of the force itself, being in a ready status. And so there really was a timing to this and a window of opportunity. You also have to look at the weather. The weather in February is a lot better than it is in March. The rains begin in March. And so while I was somewhat surprised that they chose to do this during the daytime, I think they were looking for the element of surprise, and that was part of this, what factored into the timing of this. Griff.
All right, National Chief Correspondent Jennifer Griffin, thank you very much.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.